On September 27th, 2019, just after 9:10 in the morning, Clint Coleman turned a rust-streaked 1998 Ford F-150 with 312,400 miles into the dealership lot that sat on the line between Marshall County and Grundy County. The truck coughed once before settling into an uneven idle. His faded bib overalls carried soybean dust at the knees and cuff. One boot sole had been stitched with baling twine so neatly it looked intentional. People in the glass showroom noticed him before he opened the door, and they placed him in a category they understood. Parts counter customer. Maybe tire quote. Maybe an hour of talk and no sale. Wayne Haskins watched from the service desk with a coffee cup in one hand and a pen clipped to a crisp dealership shirt. Wayne drove a 2-year-old diesel pickup with dealer plates, traded every 24 months, and sold confidence as much as machinery. His language was monthly payment, tax strategy, fleet turnover, productivity gain. He had built a strong book of business on 7.4% notes with 10-year amortization schedules, and he was good enough to make large numbers feel small by dividing them into 30-day slices. He glanced at Clint's truck, then at the 2 junior salesmen shadowing him that quarter, and gave them the kind of look that served as a lesson before a word was spoken. Clint did not notice or did not care. He stepped in, took off his cap, and asked to see the 2016 Combine parked behind the main shed. The one listed at $348,000 with 1,146 separator hours and a header cart included. Wayne brightened, then narrowed his eyes when he realized Clint was asking about serial numbers, feeder house chain wear, and auger flighting thickness, not monthly incentives. The gap between appearance and inquiry landed in the room with a small, quiet force. One salesman whispered that Clint probably wanted a brochure to compare against used inventory in Cedar Falls. Wayne nodded as if that was obvious. What none of them knew yet was that Clint Coleman had spent 38 years building wealth in a form that never shined under fluorescent lights. He farmed a patchwork across Marshall, Grundy, and Black Hawk counties, not as a grand operation, but as a disciplined one. 160 acres here, 80 there, rented tracts that penciled out, purchased ground only when cash and margins agreed. He had not carried a machinery note since 1992. His household spending had averaged $31,000 a year for more than a decade, including utilities, groceries, medical premiums, truck fuel, and property tax on a modest farmhouse he had paid off early. He looked like a man hanging on. On paper, he was a man compounding. The arithmetic started in pain. In 1984, when Clint was 23, his father lost 80 acres under a variable rate loan that reset from 9.2% to 19.6% in 18 months. That shift alone took an annual interest burden from manageable to crushing. The principal was $142,000. At 9.2%, interest cost had been about $13,064 per year. At 19.6%, it jumped to $27,832 before a dollar of principal reduction. Their corn sold weak that year, and soybean basis moved against them. The note did not care about weather, price, or effort. The land was auctioned in November. Clint never forgot the sound of bids arriving faster than breath. He also never forgot what disappeared first: options. His father did not fail because he was lazy or foolish. He failed because variable debt met volatile agriculture at exactly the wrong time. That distinction mattered to Clint for the next 4 decades. His father worked wage jobs after the sale, paid what he could, and died in 1998 without owning ground again. Clint inherited no acreage and no hidden account, only an old tool chest, a 1974 socket set with 3 missing pieces, and a rule that hardened into philosophy. If the weather and markets already own uncertainty, debt must not own the rest. Clint did not explain any of this in showrooms, but the same discipline behind his patched overalls would eventually force bankers and dealers to reckon with risk on his terms, and the numbers only sharpened from there. Clint began with rented acres and repair labor. In 1986, he farmed 120 acres on a crop share arrangement and cleared $18,400 after expenses and rent. He put $12,000 into a reserve account and lived on the rest with seasonal welding jobs. In 1987, he farmed 180 acres, netted $26,700, saved $17,500. In 1988, he bought a used 1978 grain drill for $650 at an estate auction and rebuilt openers for $210 in parts. In 1989, he purchased a 1969 tractor at $8,900 cash, then spent 2 winters restoring hydraulic lines and wiring harnesses himself, bringing total cost to $10,240. A comparable finance machine new that year would have required payments near $14,000 annually over 7 years. Clint kept the cash difference and called that his growth plan. By the spring of 1992, he made the decision that defined everything after it. He sold 2 underperforming cattle sheds, dropped a side enterprise that tied up working capital, and paid off his remaining machinery note in full, $23,870. He wrote it in red ink in a ledger he kept in a kitchen drawer. Note balance, 0. It stayed 0. He still used short-term operating lines occasionally, but only when grain and bin already covered repayment under conservative price assumptions. If corn at $3.20 and soybean at $8.40 did not service the line with margin left, he did not draw it. From 1993 through 2003, his pattern looked boring to outsiders and powerful to anyone reading long-horizon data. He bought land no one fought over, odd-shaped parcels near drainage issues, tracks with poor fence lines, fields that needed tile repair. He paid $1,180 per acre for 72 acres in 1994. He paid $1,460 per acre for 96 acres in 1998. He paid $1,925 per acre for 120 acres in 2003 after 2 larger operators passed because the field entrances were inconvenient for oversized equipment. Clint liked inconvenience when it came with a discount. He fixed tiles slowly, improved fertility deliberately, and accepted lower short-run glamour for better long-run control. His living cost remained plain. Housing cost was effectively 0 after payoff, aside from maintenance averaging $3,400 yearly. Food averaged $6,800. Utilities and heating averaged $4,900. Clothing rarely exceeded $600, including insulated coveralls every 4 years and work gloves by the dozen. Truck maintenance averaged $2,700 because he refused replacement psychology. Insurance and medical averaged $7,300. Property tax and miscellaneous averaged $5,300. Annual total, roughly $31,000. In years of stronger margins, he did not upgrade lifestyle. He expanded buffer accounts. The truck became local folklore, without Clint participating in the joke. By 2011, the Ford had over 250,000 miles, rust around both vendors, and a bench seat repaired with canvas. Neighbors speculated he could not afford newer. The true figure in his equipment reserve account that year was $214,000. By 2015, it reached $297,400. By harvest 2018, it was $356,900, built through deliberate annual transfers. $18,000 in weak years, $42,000 in strong years, never skipped. He treated machinery replacement the way others treated mortgage payments, except his payment went to himself first. His discipline showed at auctions where urgency made most mistakes. In March 2016, he bought a grain cart for $19,500 during a liquidation, where a similar model had sold for $31,000 at dealer retail the month before. He spent $3,200 repairing bearings and flighting. Total in, $22,700. In 2017, he bought a planter for $28,000, put in $6,400, and ran it for 6 seasons with average annual maintenance under $2,000. He recorded every bolt, every filter, every seal, not because he was sentimental about old iron, but because predictability was a financial instrument when interest rates moved and input markets broke loose. Even before the broader economy entered its violent phase, the pressure lines were already visible in late 2019. Input volatility was rising. Trade uncertainty was draining confidence. Dealers were leaning harder into financing packages that looked efficient on paper and fragile under stress. Wayne's model needed turnover. Clint's model needed patience. That was the underlying tension standing between them in that bright showroom with polished floors and financing posters. Wayne handed Clint a printed package for the 2016 Combine. $35,000 down, 10-year amortization, projected total repayment, $486,200. He tapped the page where a monthly payment was highlighted and began his practiced explanation about smart growth and tax efficiency. Clint listened, looked once more through the window at his own rust-streaked truck, then set the folder down and said quietly that he would take the Combine without financing. Wayne smiled in a way that was not friendly and asked him to repeat himself. Clint repeated it. Wayne called over the 2 junior salesmen, and in front of them asked a second time, adding that cash purchases at that level were not realistic for someone who still drove that truck. Clint held his gaze, thanked him for the quote, and said he would be back in the morning. He kept his word. At 8:42 the next morning, Clint Coleman rolled back into the same lot, in the same rust-streaked 1998 Ford F-150, now showing 312,417 miles on an odometer that stuck for 2 seconds between digits. The right rear quarter panel still wore a bloom of orange rust. The driver's seat still listed left. His overalls were the same faded pair, clean but permanently stained at the thighs, and the bailing twine stitch on his boot had been tightened with a fresh knot. Wayne Haskins saw him through the glass before the door opened and gave the junior salesman a small grin that suggested the lesson from yesterday was about to be repeated. Wayne looked dealership polished down to the details. Pressed logo shirt, clean cap, tan leather belt, smartwatch face glowing with scheduled calls, keys to a 2-year-old diesel pickup set where they could be seen. He greeted Clint with practiced ease, folder already in hand, and started talking again about down payment structure, tax timing, and a 10-year note at 7.4%. Clint did not sit. He set a plain envelope on Wayne's desk, slid out a cashier check for $348,000, and placed it next to the printed quote that projected $486,200 in total repayment under financing. Then he added a second sheet, itemized in his block handwriting. 16 consecutive annual transfers into an equipment reserve account, from $18,000 in a lean year to $42,000 in a strong one. Total contributions, $402,700. Cumulative withdrawals, $46,800. Current available balance before purchase, $355,900, plus grain sale proceeds. The room went quiet in a way that made fluorescent lights sound louder. Wayne picked up the check, turned it over, set it down, and asked which bank issued it. Clint told him. Wayne asked whether he could verify funds. Clint nodded once. Wayne put the call on speaker. A branch officer confirmed the instrument number, the amount, and collected funds status. One junior salesman looked from the paper to Clint's boots, then back to the paper as if the numbers should rearrange themselves into something more familiar. Clint only asked for delivery timing and service records. That moment looked sudden to everyone in the showroom, but its roots were old and unglamorous. Clint had built his model from a memory he never dramatized. November 1984, his father standing near an auction wagon, while 80 acres went to the highest bidder after variable interest climbed from 9.2% to 19.6%. Clint did not turn that story into a sermon. He turned it into a decision rule. If a note required perfect weather or perfect prices, it was too much note. If a purchase depended on optimism, it waited. If a machine could be repaired for one season, at a known cost, repair beat replacement almost every time. In 1986, with no inherited land and no safety net, he leased 120 acres on crop share and worked winter welding shifts in Marshall County. Gross crop revenue came to $61,300. Total cash expense and rent share, $42,900. Net $18,400. He saved $12,000 and carried $6,400 for living and truck repair. In 1987, he increased to 180 acres, netted $26,700, and saved $17,500. In 1988, he bought a used 1978 grain drill for $650, spent $210 on openers and bearings, and avoided a finance replacement that would have cost about $4,900 per year. In 1989, he paid $8,900 cash for a 1969 tractor, put in $1,340 across 2 winters, and logged 620 field hours without a payment coupon in sight. He did not do it alone at first. An older operator in Grundy County, Lyle Brenner, rented him 40 acres in 1990 at a below-market rate and told him, "Pay me when you can. Just do not miss seed timing." Lyle also taught him to keep 2 ledgers, one for taxes and one for truth. The truth ledger tracked machine hours, repair intervals, and the real cost per acre after fuel and downtime. In 1991, that ledger showed Clint's repaired tillage setup running $27.40 per acre, while neighbors with newer financed equipment were near $61 once principal, interest, depreciation, and dealer service were honestly counted. The difference was not pride, it was survival margin. By spring 1992, Clint sold 2 small cattle sheds for $31,200, liquidated a side herd for $14,500 net, and applied the combined $45,700 to clear his remaining machinery note at $23,870, plus deferred interest and fees, then banked the rest as reserve. He wrote one line in red ink that became operating doctrine: machinery balance 0. From then forward, short-term operating credit was permitted only against grain already in bin under conservative price assumptions. He stress-tested every draw at corn $3.20 and soybeans $8.40. If those numbers did not cover repayment with room left, he passed. The progression that followed looked plain from the road and formidable on paper. 1994 bought 72 acres at $1,180 per acre, total $84,960, cash. 1998 bought 96 acres at $1,460, total $140,160. Cash plus 1 year's seller, carry paid off in 10 months. 2003 bought 120 acres at $1,925, total $231,000, cash after 2 strong soybean years. 2008 bought 80 acres at $2,900, total $232,000, partly from reserve and partly from prepaid grain contracts. 2011 installed tile and fertility upgrades at $41,600 over 3 seasons, raising average corn yield on that tract from 154 bushels per acre to 189. 2014 passed on a 0% dealer teaser tied to mandatory bundled service because total effective costs exceeded self-maintained used equipment by $96 per acre over 5 years. 2018, equipment reserve reached $356,900. Before we go any further, if you want to see exactly how this one decision keeps paying out through the 2020 to 2026 volatility cycle, subscribe now because the arithmetic gets sharper from here and every county rumor gets tested against real numbers. His early discipline showed up most clearly at auctions, where urgency and ego inflated bids faster than asset value. In March 2016, he bought a grain cart for $19,500 at liquidation, when a similar dealer unit listed near $31,000. He spent $3,200 on bearings, flighting, paint, and labor with his own tools. Total basis, $22,700. In 2017, he bought a planter for $28,000, put in $6,400, ran it 6 seasons, and averaged under $2,000 annual maintenance. In 2018, he rebuilt a header trailer axle for $740 rather than replace at $5,600. In each case, he treated repair as capital allocation, not nostalgia. Wayne sold speed and image. Clint bought function and margin. His household budget reinforced the same pattern. Housing maintenance averaged $3,400 per year. Food averaged $6,800. Utilities and heating averaged $4,900. Clothing stayed under $600 most years. Truck maintenance averaged $2,700. Insurance and medical averaged $7,300. Property tax and miscellaneous averaged $5,300. Annual living total held near $31,000 in years, when peers quietly moved to $68,000 or $82,000 lifestyles tied to borrowed prosperity. Clint was not performing frugality for applause. He simply refused fixed costs that demanded perfect harvests. By late afternoon that day, after papers were signed, Wayne tried one last reframing in front of staff. He said cash tied up working capital and that smart operators leveraged cheap money for growth. Clint answered with 14 words. Cheap money is expensive when prices fall and rates rise at once. He did not raise his voice. He did not linger. He asked for delivery date, warranty transfer details, and service manuals. Then he walked out, climbed into the old Ford, and drove toward the county line with a paid-in full combine scheduled for his yard. The story would have stayed inside that building if agriculture had remained calm. It did not. Within months, the cycle turned hard. Inputs climbed, basis moved unpredictably, and financing that felt manageable in presentations started behaving like a vice in real weather. People around Marshall, Grundy, and Blackhawk counties began revisiting one uncomfortable scene from a bright showroom floor. The farmer with stitched boots, a rusted truck, and a cashier check no one believed until the bank confirmed it on speaker. Wayne kept selling finance turnover on local radio and called Clint an outlier when asked. Clint kept running the same plan: reserve first, equipment fund second, land only when cash and margin aligned. By the second week of October 2019, 3 different operators had asked him, quietly and off to the side, what percentage of gross he moved into reserves in weak years versus strong years. He told each one the same numbers, no speech attached: minimum 10%, target 22, and no skipped year unless weather erased the crop. Lyle Brenner passed away the following spring at 81, and his funeral in Grundy County drew more farmers than some co-op annual meetings. Clint stood near the back, said little, and left an envelope for Lyle's daughter before he walked out. Inside was a cashier check for $42,000 and one note: rent discount from 1990, repaid with gratitude and interest. She cried in the church office after most people had gone. Clint was already in the truck by then, heading home to grease fittings before rain, because that was his rhythm in every season: modest from the road, exact in the ledger, and never careless with what uncertainty could take away. Rain hit the machine shed roof 3 minutes after Clint backed the Ford under cover. He killed the engine, sat for one breath, and carried 2 ledgers inside before he touched a grease gun. The first was the tax copy. The second was the truth ledger Lyle had taught him to keep: pages full of hand-ruled columns for acres, yield, basis, fuel repairs, interest paid, and interest avoided. He added one new line in careful block letters: September 28th, 2019. Combine, $348,000. Paid cash. Financing avoided $138,200, total scheduled interest and fee spread. Then he wrote the monthly figure he had just refused: $4,051.67 for 120 months, and circled a different plan beside it: transfer to reserve first, then to land opportunity fund. By the end of October 2019, Harvest had closed on 934 operated acres across the Marshall, Grundy, and Blackhawk patchwork, 552 in corn and 382 in soybeans. Corn yield averaged 191 bushels per acre on owned ground and 183 on rented tracts. Soybean yield averaged 57.4. Weighted sales after basis and storage netted $3.81 per bushel on corn and $9.02 on soybeans. Gross crop revenue reached $913,447. Cash operating expense, including seed, chemical, fuel repairs, crop insurance, drying, and labor help, totaled $521,930. Land rent and property tax added $100 to $47,660. Household draw remained $31,200. Net before income tax was $212,657. And with no machinery principal and no long-term note service, he moved $82,000 into emergency reserve and $48,000 back into equipment sinking. The combine was paid, and the cash discipline resumed immediately. In 2020, he expanded only where numbers stayed conservative, taking 46 additional rented acres in Black Hawk County after another operator exited. He refused two other tracts because the landlord terms required fertilizer guarantees that erased margin at low-price scenarios. Spring input contracts were set early. Nitrogen at $412 per ton, potash at $318, diesel hedged through co-op, prepaid gallons at $2.11. Weather cooperated, but price did not. Corn futures sank near $3.10 during the spring panic before recovering. Clint marketed in thirds, cash flow first, storage second, basis contracts last. Final blended corn price was $3.67. Soybeans settled at $9.41 blended. Gross revenue came in at $889,060. Expenses were $548,774, higher on drying and fungicide passes. Net before tax, $180,486. He transferred $60,000 to emergency reserve, $40,000 to equipment fund, and bought 22 acres of awkward creek border ground at a county tax sale for $2,740 per acre. Total $60,280 cash because adjoining access improved one of his older fields by shortening haul distance 1.8 miles each load. In 2021, the cycle bent the other direction. Acreage held at 980. Corn price climbed and held better than most expected. His blended final was $5.43, soybeans $12.61. Fertility costs had not yet exploded. Because he had prepaid part of his program in late 2020, gross revenue reached $1,276,904. Total operating expense and rent rose to $676,115, and he accepted the increase without panic because fixed debt service remained near zero outside a short operating line that was drawn and repaid in 97 days. Net before tax, $569,589. He did not buy a new pickup. He did not remodel the house. He moved $210,000 to Treasury bills, laddered at short maturities, $140,000 to emergency reserve, $95,000 to land opportunity cash, and $54,000 to a maintenance escrow for future engine and hydraulic rebuilds. If he had carried the combine financing Wayne proposed, that year still would have looked strong. Clint did the math anyway. 10-year note payment would have removed $48,620 from yearly flexibility, and he treated flexibility as crop insurance, no policy sold. In 2022, input shock arrived with full force. Nitrogen quotes crossed $1,020 per ton in some windows. Diesel touched $5.09. Parts lead times stretched past planting decisions. Clint responded the way he always had, by reducing the number of variables he did not control. He shifted 74 acres from corn to soybeans, where fertility carryover allowed, negotiated a lower cash rent on one Grundy tract in exchange for tile maintenance done at his expense, and locked custom spraying rates early. Operated acres, 1,006. Gross revenue, $1,308,332, helped by a blended corn price of $6.81 and soybeans at $14.18. Total expense climbed to $901,447. Net before tax, $406,885. He moved $110,000 to reserve, bought 64 acres with drainage issues at $4,980 per acre for $318,720 cash and reserved $72,000 for tile work over 3 seasons. That parcel appraised at only $4,700 at purchase due to condition, but his margin model valued it on post-improvement yield potential, not present appearance. By March 2023, the old Ford showed 328,900 miles, fresh rust blooming along the rocker panels, and the same stitched boot climbed out at every co-op meeting. Clint looked poorer than many men carrying 7-figure debt packages. His ledger looked nothing like his truck. Emergency reserve stood at $1,046,300 across insured accounts and short bills. Equipment sinking fund stood at $392,600 after routine draws. Land opportunity cash sat at $441,000. Estimated land equity on owned acres, at conservative local comparables rather than peak auction headlines, passed $6,800,000. He had not become wealthy in one price spike. He had become solvent in every weather pattern, and that was a different category entirely. By early 2023, those contrasts stopped being private and started showing up across the corridor as neighboring operators posted outcomes that exposed how differently leverage and reserve first discipline held under the same volatility. Aaron Pike had been one of the most admired operators in the corridor in 2018. He was hard-working, technically sharp, and known for immaculate fields. He expanded from 600 acres to 1,400 in less than 4 seasons, financed at first on what looked like manageable terms. Operating debt priced at 6.9% reset in stages to 11.3 as rates climbed. He carried machinery notes, land rent guarantees, and input advances at the same time. In 2021, when prices were strong, his gross receipts were excellent, but fixed obligations had already hardened. By 2023, his annual interest burden reached $227,000 before principal, with another $174,000 in scheduled machinery payments. A single weak basis window and lower than projected yields turned a paper success model into a liquidity problem inside 1 quarter. Aaron did not fail from laziness. He got trapped by timing and leverage. Denise Harrow made a different version of the same decision under pressure to modernize. She signed a 5-year package on new iron totaling $610,000, justified by dealer projections based on normal weather and stable fuel. For 2 seasons, she hit the assumptions, then drought cut her average corn yield from 192 bushels per acre to 128 on key tracks, while fertilizer and diesel rose at the same time. Interest carried no mercy. The machinery was excellent. The math stopped working. Bankruptcy filing came with visible exhaustion, not irresponsibility. She had done what she was told was prudent growth, and the sequence turned against her. Miguel Tovar entered rented ground through variable land debt that depended on 2 solid harvests to settle into rhythm. He got neither. Input costs climbed, grain prices whipsawed, and one storm event damaged a field at the wrong growth stage. His operating notes did not explode from one bad choice. They tightened from 3 average setbacks in a row. By late 2023, he could not service all short-term obligations and maintain equipment, and he faced the same auction calendar too many good farmers have faced. Roy and Carla Jensen were older, careful, and not reckless in character. They refinanced twice to hold acreage that had been in family hands for decades, hoping rates would settle and margins recover. Instead, reset terms and weak harvest economics collided. Court-supervised liquidation forced sale of the home place. Neighbors watched and said little because they understood exactly how close many operations were to the same edge. Clint attended 2 of those auctions in work gloves and the same faded cap. He did not stand where people expected theater. He bid only on items he knew had long, useful life left and practical fit for the families losing them. At Aaron's sale, he bought a planter under liquidation pressure for $24,800, a unit that had carried a note balance far above that. At the Jensen dispersal, he bought a grain cart for $17,600, less than replacement value by a wide margin. He did not flip either asset for profit, though private buyers offered more within days. He cleaned them, stored them, and marked both entries with a side notation in the Truth Ledger: hold for structured return when panic clears. 3 days later, Wayne ran a local radio segment repeating that modern scale required modern financing and that rare cash buyers should not drive policy for everyone else. He called Clint an outlier again. He was not entirely wrong on one point. Clint's path was unusual because it required years of saying no while others looked faster. The resulting tension was that unusual had become survivable, while normal had become brittle. Then the weather turned. The 2023 season opened with uneven moisture and closed with hard regional variance. One Blackhawk block on Clint's map held near trendline. 2 Marshall fields fell short after heat stress during pollination. Across the wider corridor, yields spread widened so far that neighbors 10 miles apart reported completely different economics. At the same time, policy rate hikes pushed credit costs higher in every operating renewal conversation. Corn that had touched high levels in prior windows moved back toward thin margin territory for operators carrying heavy note service, and soybean strength could not rescue everyone from structure. Clint's numbers that year were not glamorous. They were stable. Operated acres increased to 1,028 after one landlord requested continuity. Blended corn price settled at $4.79, soybeans at $11.92. Gross revenue, $1,041,506. Total expenses, including elevated input carry and rent, were $812,444. Net before tax, $229,062. He booked it without celebration. Reserve transfer, $70,000. Equipment fund transfer, $35,000. Land opportunity transfer, $40,000. Household draw unchanged at $31,000. Interest paid on short operating line, $7,840, cleared immediately after post-harvest sales. Interest paid on long-term machinery debt, 0. For comparison, he ran one internal scenario in the ledger margins, the same fields and prices, but with Wayne's 2019 combine terms plus 2 additional financed upgrades many neighbors had taken in 2021. Under that structure, annual debt service would have been about $181,000 across machinery lines. The modeled year-end cash would have dropped below lender cushion thresholds by $43,000. No catastrophe needed. Just arithmetic. By January 2024, with flood risk warnings building and planning calendars tightening, county coffee talk changed tone. People stopped arguing about image and started asking for spreadsheets. Clint answered briefly when asked, often with the same sentence: sequence matters more than horsepower. Wayne still had clients and still sold units, but his certainty no longer carried the room by default. In Marshall, Grundy, and Blackhawk counties, the farmers who had once laughed at a stitched boot now studied the columns that Boot had walked through for nearly 4 decades, because the crisis had done what debate could not. It had audited every philosophy against weather, rates, and time. The room that had once treated Clint as a curiosity was the same room the county board borrowed for emergency lender mediation. And on that January afternoon, every chair was full by 12 minutes before the start. Aaron Pike sat in the second row with a yellow legal pad and 3 columns of figures he had rewritten twice already. Denise Harrow kept both hands around a paper cup gone cold. Miguel Tovar stood along the wall near the door, shoulders tight, saying very little. Wayne Haskins arrived in a pressed quarter zip with dealership branding and a stack of financing, one sheets he no longer handed out as freely as he once had. Clint came in last, cap in hand, overalls clean but worn thin at one knee, and set a plain brown folder on the front table without ceremony. The board chair opened with numbers no one could dismiss: 3 operations in active distress, 2 others on watch status. 45 days before equipment access and input liquidity closed the planning window. A local bank officer followed with the hard part: no extension without collateral that could survive another volatile year. That was when Clint slid the folder across the table and asked the officer to read page 2 aloud. Coleman Equipment Trust. Initial funded cash balance, $1,200,000. Immediate bridge disbursement authority, up to $460,000 total, 0% interest. Deferred principal triggers tied to profitable harvest years only. Collateral structure: equipment title retained in trust until staged buyout complete. Default remedy: cure period with field-level mediation before repossession rights. Maintenance covenant: document service intervals mandatory, costs shared by recipient and trust reserve. Mentorship covenant: each recipient must train one beginning operator for 2 seasons. The bank officer paused at the signature line, looked up once, then continued with attachment schedules. Schedule A listed the 2016 combine Clint had paid in full for $348,000. Schedule B listed the restored planter bought at Aaron's auction for $24,800 plus $7,340 in refurbishment. Total basis, $32,140. Schedule C listed the Jensen grain cart bought for $17,600 plus $4,920 restoration. Total basis, $22,500 to $20. Schedule D listed liquid treasury holdings earmarked for contingency draws inside the trust. When he reached the final page, he read the conservative net worth statement Clint had signed under penalty language. Total assets, $9,417,300. Total liabilities, $236,900. Short duration operating line. Net position, $9,180,400 as of January 15th, 2024. No one gasped theatrically. This county did not do theatrics well. It did silence, and then chairs shifting, and then careful breathing while people resorted assumptions they had carried for years. Wayne asked whether the statement had been independently reviewed. The officer said yes, reviewed against land records, cash accounts, and equipment titles, then added one sentence that moved through the room like weather front. This is stronger collateral than most regional portfolios we see at this size. By the first week of February 2024, the revelation had done what gossip never could. It moved Clint from county folklore into county infrastructure. He did not stand and lecture. He opened the folder again, turned to disbursement pages, and started with names. Aaron Pike. Bridgeline $180,000 for seed, fertilizer, and seasonal fuel, 0%. First principal payment due only after a harvest year with net operating margin above 8%. Equipment access, lease-to-own planter package at cost basis with 5-year staged buyout. annual payment ceiling $9,500, suspended in declared weather disaster years. Denise Harrow, bridge line $140,000 to stabilize input purchases and prevent distressed prepay penalties, 0%. Repayment fixed at 30% of annual free cash flow until retired. Equipment access, grain cart lease. To own at trust basis, maintenance logs required monthly in season. Miguel Tovar, bridge line $140,000 to clear high-rate short notes and secure spring operating capacity, 0%. Repayment beginning after 2 consecutive positive quarters. Access to combine harvest schedule under trust coordination so he could finish custom acres and his own fields without predatory rental rates. Aaron read his page twice before speaking. He asked what the penalty was if corn dropped below break-even again. Clint answered in 9 words. Then you protect cash and pay later, not now. Denise asked what collateral he wanted against the bridge note. Clint tapped the covenant line and said, "Keep records. Keep your word. Train someone else." Miguel asked if there was hidden equity language that could take his rented ground. Clint shook his head once and pointed to the legal clause limiting trust claims to equipment tied to the agreement, nothing beyond it. Wayne tried one last frame, this time measured rather than mocking. He said zero-interest capital could distort local discipline and reward operators who had already misjudged risk. Clint answered with numbers, not tone. Under local dealer terms at 11.1% variable, the combined annual interest on the 3 bridge amounts would run roughly $51,060 before principal. Under trust terms, it was $0, with repayment elasticity tied to realized margin. Difference over 3 years at constant rates, about $153,180 retained on farms instead of transferred to debt service. He added the equipment spread, new financed replacement packages for equivalent capacity would total $1,040,000 with projected 10-year repayment near $1,462,000. Trust basis on restored assets plus paid combine allocation to recipients, $402,660. Even after adding projected maintenance reserve of $96,000, functional capacity cost remained less than 1/3 of finance turnover. The board attorney asked him to repeat that last line, and he did. The board chair leaned forward and posed the crux to the room in plain terms. When pressure rises, do operations optimize for appearance or for survivability? Pens moved. A few operators exchanged looks, then wrote the phrase into their margins before discussion continued. Paper became action within 10 days. The trust wired $460,000 in 3 tranches after input invoices were verified line by line. Aaron's first draw covered nitrogen and seed commitments at negotiated early payment discounts worth $11,400 he would have lost under delayed financing. Denise used her first $62,000 to settle a supplier account carrying 18% penalty terms, instantly removing a monthly bleed that had been compounding faster than her margins. Miguel cleared 2 short notes totaling $73,500 at rates above 13% and redirected his cash flow toward planting windows he would otherwise have missed. Clint oversaw equipment transfers himself, not because he needed control, but because condition determined outcome. He spent 2 long Saturdays with Aaron, calibrating meter drives and checking downforce systems on the planter. He walked Denise through grain cart load protocols to reduce drivetrain wear. He helped Miguel set a combine maintenance interval chart taped inside the cab in block letters large enough to read at dusk. 3 days before planting, open in late March, the trust held its first mentorship assignment meeting in the same dealership conference room. Each recipient had to name one beginning farmer and commit to 2 seasons of documented guidance. Aaron selected Leah Cruz, age 26, managing 140 rented acres with her parents and no machinery cushion. Denise selected Ben Alvarez, age 24, who had mechanical skill but weak marketing discipline and no reserve system. Miguel selected Parker Dunn, age 22, recently back from a non-farm job and trying to re-enter on 90 acres. None of them received cash gifts from Clint. They received seat time, repair protocols, grain marketing checklists, and one unambiguous rule. Reserves are not leftovers. Reserves are first. By mid-April 2024, floodwater along 2 low tracks in Black Hawk County delayed planting enough to test every promise on those contracts. Aaron missed his first intended field by 6 days and thought the season was slipping. Under his old structure, 6 days meant penalty cascades. Under the trust terms, it meant schedule adjustment and a call to Clint, who shifted combine maintenance dates and opened one spare tillage pass window to preserve timing on higher ground. Denise lost stand quality on 38 acres after repeated rain and had to replant with a lower yield hybrid. Her covenant allowed cost recognition without immediate payment escalation, so she absorbed agronomic loss without a financing spiral. Miguel took custom planning work on 2 neighboring parcels at fair rates, generating early cash that stabilized labor and fuel through June. At the next co-op coffee hour, copies of the agreements moved hand to hand among operators who had long insisted debt was the only route to scale, and the argument shifted from bravado to term structure, timing windows, and risk-aligned obligations. The deeper proof came in the ledgers, and Clint insisted those be read publicly at the July co-op review instead of privately in his kitchen. He stood beside a projector he disliked and walked year by year through the same arithmetic that had guided him since Red Ink in 1992. 2019, combined paid cash $348,000, financing avoided over 10 years, $138,200. Reserve transfer after purchase, $130,000 combined to emergency and equipment funds. 2020, volatility year, net before tax, $180,486, reserve and sinking transfers, $100,000 total. 2021, strong pricing year, net before tax, $569,589, risk buffer expansion, $445,000 across short bills, reserve maintenance escrow. 2022, input shock year, net before tax, $406,885. Land bought cash, $318,720, with planned improvement budget, $72,000. 2023, margin compression year, net before tax, $229,062. No long-term machinery interest. Modeled finance scenario would have reduced liquidity below lender cushion by $43,000. 2024 through July, trust deployed $460,000, bridge capital at 0%. Avoided recipient interest at prevailing rates approximately $25,530 annualized for first 6 months equivalent. Then he added the piece most operators missed when they focused only on rates. Sequence premium. If a farm avoids one forced liquidation, it preserves more than machinery value. It preserves future earning years. He projected the 3-recipient path under 2 scenarios over 5 harvest cycles. Scenario 1, conventional high-rate restructuring plus new equipment financing produced combined expected debt service of $1,184,000 and a foreclosure probability band the co-op analysts put between 32 and 46% under moderate price stress. Scenario 2, trust terms plus maintenance covenants plus mentorship labor transfer produced expected debt service of $642,000 and foreclosure probability band between 9 and 16%. Difference in expected retained farm equity by year 5, $2,740,000 across the 3 operations. He did not claim certainty. He did claim direction. Lower fixed extraction, higher optionality, stronger survival odds. The room asked harder questions than it had in January, which was its own form of respect. A lender asked whether generosity at this scale could drain Clint's own operation in a 2-year downturn. He answered with the cap written into trust bylaws. Annual giving cannot exceed trailing 3-year average free cash flow, and trust liquidity floor cannot drop below $500,000 without suspension of new commitments. A seed dealer asked whether zero interest terms encouraged complacency. Clint pointed to maintenance penalties and mentorship requirements that converted aid into obligation rather than rescue theater. Wayne sat near the back this time, took notes, and did not interrupt. By the end of that meeting, the county had its numbers. Clint's wealth was no longer rumor attached to a rusty truck. It was documented capacity converted into contracts, covenants, and outcomes that kept people in the field. And as the crowd filed out into hot July wind, Aaron, Denise, and Miguel stayed behind long enough to sign the first mentorship logs, because in Clint's structure, the money was only step 1, and the multiplication had to be earned. Aaron signed first, pressing hard enough that the pen left a groove through 2 pages. Denise signed with slower strokes, then turned her copy sideways and circled the maintenance covenant, as if marking a private oath. Miguel signed last and asked Clint one more question about parts sourcing before harvest. Clint answered with 3 supplier names, 2 salvage yards, and 1 rule about calling early instead of calling late. Then he gathered the logs, stacked them by date, and handed each of the younger mentees a blank service sheet with engine hour columns already drawn in. By the 3rd week of August 2024, the first measurable outcomes had already separated this arrangement from emergency charity. Aaron used the trust bridge to lock fertilizer at a blended $612 per ton equivalent, instead of buying in-season spikes above $800. On 600 leased-back acres, his direct cost per acre fell from $742 in 2023 to $603 projected, mostly from interest removal and calmer purchasing. He harvested a mixed but profitable crop, posted an 11.4% net operating margin, and triggered his first voluntary principal payment of $42,000, even though his contract only required payment above 8%. He also met every mentorship hour with Leah Cruz, who learned to run pre-harvest loss checks and avoided a drying bottleneck that had cost her family nearly $9,000 the prior year. Denise's path was narrower and harder, but it held. Her bankruptcy plan was amended in October 2024 after trust-supported input timing improved cash flow predictability. She sold corn at a blended $4.93 and soybeans at $12.08, held 180 acres, and stabilized her supplier terms enough to remove punitive penalties. Her first-year free cash flow payment to the trust was $18,600. In 2025, she paid $35,400. By autumn 2026, she had repaid $84,000 of her $140,000 bridge line, exactly 60%, while maintaining compliance on every maintenance and mentorship covenant. Ben Alvarez, her mentee, was the quiet surprise. He copied her reserve discipline, moved from zero to $27,300 in operating reserve in 2 seasons, and cut his chemical over-application cost by $38 per acre through better record-keeping. Miguel made the sharpest operational pivot. The trust terms gave him room to abandon panic acres and build a custom planting route that paid quickly. In 2024, he serviced 1,120 custom acres at an average $24.50 per acre, gross, then added fall tillage on 410 acres at $18. He cleared his highest rate short debt first, then the rest, and entered 2025 with no short-term notes above standard operating terms. By June 2026, he bought a used 2009 tractor for $62,000 cash, 6,800 hours, one owner, and a maintenance file thicker than some loan packets. Parker Dunn, his mentee, leased 90 acres in 2024 and 150 by 2026, never missing a reserve transfer month, even in weak basis periods. The numbers were plain and powerful. One trust intervention helped preserve 3 operations and train 3 more, which meant 6 viable farm businesses where the county had projected 3 likely failures. Roy and Carla Jensen were not direct bridge recipients, but Clint did not leave their thread unfinished. After liquidation, they entered a cattle share agreement in early 2025 on leased pasture tied to their former home place, now owned by a regional investor who preferred steady tenants over turnover. Clint structured the paperwork with their attorney and fronted $36,000 for herd entry costs under a separate zero-interest note with quarterly reporting. Their first-year net was modest, $28,700 after feed and vet costs. Their second year was stronger at $49,200, enough to retire half the note and rebuild savings they thought were gone for good. They did not recover old title. They recovered stability. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure hits your own life, do you choose a structure that looks fast or a structure that can survive 2 bad seasons in a row? That question is the hinge in every version of this story. The multiplier effect became visible in county totals by the end of 2026. Trust Bridge Principal deployed $460,000. Principal repaid by recipients through 2026, $198,400. Interest charged, $0. Estimated commercial interest avoided at comparable variable rates over the same period, $121,700. Foreclosure actions prevented among direct recipients. 3. Beginning farmers mentored under covenant. 3 in the first cycle, then 3 additional in second cycle pairings begun in 2026. Combined acres operated by direct recipients and mentees by autumn 2026, 2,310. At a conservative land value proxy of $7,000 per acre across mixed quality, those operating relationships sat atop roughly $16,170,000 in productive ground that remained actively farmed instead of fragmented by distressed sales. Clint never described it as heroics. He called it sequence with paperwork. Wayne Haskins watched all of this from a position that kept getting narrower. Through late 2024, he continued dealership work, still closing finance packages. But his language changed first in private meetings and later in public. He began adding stress test columns to proposals at 9% and 11% interest scenarios. He asked clients about reserve months on hand before discussing horsepower. Some laughed and said he sounded like Clint. Wayne did not argue. In March 2025, at a county board review that included lenders, co-op officers, and equipment reps, he was asked directly whether financed expansion should remain the default recommendation for volatile operations. He paused long enough for the room to settle, and then answered without hedging. For high-variance cash flow farms, debt minimization and cash reserves outperform aggressive upgrade cycles more often than we admitted. He said commissions from turnover had looked excellent in stable years, but he had buried too many customer files after rates and weather turned together. He did not ask for applause. None came. Respect came instead, quieter and more durable. By spring 2027, Wayne retired from dealership sales and moved into used equipment consulting across Marshall and Grundy, helping operators evaluate life cycle cost, rebuild timing, and realistic utilization instead of pushing universal replacement schedules. His income dropped from peak commission years, but so did his moral strain. He told two younger reps during their first winter training that a finance sale is easy to celebrate on delivery day and hard to defend on auction day. That line stayed with them. If you are learning something from this, pass it along to one person who mistakes payment size for affordability, because that confusion has emptied more farmyards than drought ever did. Clint did not change his appearance when the numbers became public record. By harvest 2026, his Ford showed 341,200 miles, paint thinner than ever, rust widened near the wheel wells, and the baling twine repair had finally been replaced by a proper sole after a neighbor left boots on his porch without a note. He still wore faded overalls. He still brought a plain lunch to the field. What changed was what the county could verify. He controlled 1,120 acres across Marshall, Grundy, and Blackhawk counties, carried no long-term machinery debt, and held a conservative net worth estimate of $9,400,000 with quarterly variance depending on land comps and grain inventory. His annual giving remained capped by bylaw at trailing free cash flow, which kept generosity durable and prevented performative promises. Every named thread found its ending on paper and on ground. Aaron Pike operated debt light on 600 leased-back acres, logged 2 profitable years, and rebuilt lender credibility without returning to high-rate expansion. Denise Harrow exited bankruptcy supervision, kept her 180 acres, and converted survival into a repeatable operating plan that Ben Alvarez now used on his own acres. Miguel Tovar became known for reliable custom planting, cleared short-term debt, bought his tractor cash, and mentored Parker Dunn into independent acreage growth. Roy and Carla Jensen remained on their former home place as lessees, not owners, but with a working cattle share ledger that turned grief into forward motion. Leah Cruz expanded cautiously and finished 2026 with positive working capital for the first time. Lyle Brenner remained where he had been since the funeral, in memory and in method. His 2-ledger lessons still shaped every trust meeting, and his daughter kept the $42,000 repayment in a separate account earmarked for local apprenticeship tuition. The combine that started the public turning point kept running through each of those seasons, paid in full from day one, then transferred into structure that preserved more than one balance sheet. Its separator hours climbed, its maintenance logs stayed immaculate, and every recipient who used it signed the same covenant line about service intervals before signatures about money. Machinery in Clint's world was never status. It was a tool, and tools were either owned by your plan or rented from your panic. Hey, before we close this story, subscribe if you want more real arithmetic from real operations, not showroom slogans. Then leave a comment with one number you now track differently, reserve percent, fixed cost per acre, or interest avoided. Then share this with the person in your life who looks ordinary from the road but keeps everyone else afloat when weather and rates turn rough. By late October 2026, after one more long day of soybeans under a pale sky, Clint turned at the end rows and set the paid-for combine into another clean pass. Dust lifted behind the header in a steady line. At the road, the old Ford waited by the field gate, rust catching the last light. No banner, no speech. Just a man who had been underestimated for decades, families still on their land, and numbers that had finally taught the county what appearance never could. Dust settled across the headlands, and Clint kept the combine idling long enough to finish one more line in the cab log before he climbed down. Separator hours, 1,982.4. Fuel burn, 1.14 gallons per acre. Chain tension checked at sunset. Aaron Pike was waiting at the field gate with a metal clipboard and an envelope sealed with clear tape. Boots muddy to the ankle, face worn but steady in a way that had not been true 3 years earlier. Aaron handed over the envelope first. Inside was a bank check for $63,400, memo line reading Coleman Equipment Trust Principal. Then he passed the clipboard. 2 columns, simple and exact. 2026 net operating margin, 12.1% on 600 acres. Mentorship hours with Leah Cruz, 146 document, including planter calibration days and 2 grain marketing sessions, where they sold in 3 tranches instead of one distressed dump. Clint read the sheet, nodded once, and asked one question. Reserve transfer made? Aaron tapped the second page. 22% of net. Done in October. No speech followed. Clint signed the receipt copy, tore off Aaron's duplicate, and tucked the check into the same plain envelope with Denise's payment stub and Miguel's transfer confirmation from the day before. That envelope went into the brown folder, first seen on the county board table, and the folder went behind the truck seat for the night because the bank drop box was on his route before dawn. 3 days later, a cold rain came through Marshall County, and the trust held its year-end compliance meeting in the co-op classroom that smelled like coffee and damp coats. Denise Harrow arrived early with a ledger binder indexed by month tabs she had cut from feed sack cardboard. She set out service records for the grain cart, each interval signed and dated, and a repayment schedule highlighted in yellow. $84,000 returned on the $140,000 bridge note. By November 2026, 60% complete, no late months. She had also attached Ben Alvarez's reserve sheet. Starting reserve in January 2025, $2,100. Reserve in November 2026, $27,300. Input savings from corrected chemical rates, $38 per acre on 210 acres, verified by invoices and application maps. Miguel Tovar came in carrying a folded cap and a parts invoice packet for his 2009 tractor, the one he had bought cash for $62,000. He laid down his custom work statement. 1,340 planted acres in 2026 at $25.25 per acre average, plus 400 to 60 acres of fall tillage at $19. Gross custom revenue, $42,935, net after fuel and wear, $27,440. He had 0 short-term debt above standard operating terms, and he paid another $51,000 to trust principal that week. Parker Dunn sat beside him and read from his own sheet when asked, voice unsteady at first, then firmer, 150 acres operated. Reserve transfers made every month. No skipped machinery maintenance logs. First year ever with positive year-end working capital at $18,900. In the second week of December 2026, the board accountant presented the multiplier table Clint had insisted be public. Direct trust bridge deployed since formation, $460,000. Principal repaid by N 2026, $198,400. Interest charge, $0. Estimated commercial interest avoided under comparable variable notes, $121,700 through that date. Foreclosure actions among direct recipients after trust activation, none. Beginning operators trained through covenant and second cycle pairings, 6. Combined acres operated by direct recipients and mentees by autumn 2026, 2,310. Conservative productive ground value under those operators, using $7,050 per acre, blended $16,285,500. The room stayed quiet long enough for the numbers to land as fact rather than inspiration. Roy and Carla Jensen's thread closed in that same meeting with their attorney present and both signatures on a release form. Their cattle share note, originally $36,000, had been reduced to $11,200 after 8 straight on-time quarterly payments. Carla read the final 2 lines herself because she wanted them in the minutes. Herd count, stabilized at 47 head, emergency reserve restored to $19,600. No missed lease payment on the former home place. Roy thanked Clint in one sentence, then thanked the investor who had agreed to patient lease terms. He did not get his old deed back. He got his footing back. And he said that mattered more than pride now. Wayne Haskins received his full resolution. In March 2027, under fluorescent lights he used to command, the county board asked him to teach a winter seminar for young sales representatives from 3 dealerships, and he accepted on one condition: no commission rankings on the slides. He stood in front of a projector with his old confidence reduced to something better, and opened with 2 case files he had permission to share, one from a financed expansion that failed, one from a reserve first plan that survived lower prices and higher rates. He did not name Clint at first. He did by the 3rd slide. I asked him to repeat himself twice, Wayne said. I thought cash at that scale from that truck was not credible. I was wrong about the signal. I looked at appearance and missed liquidity. He walked the room through payment illusions line by line. A $348,000 combine financed at 7.4% over 10 years looked manageable monthly, but total repayment at $486,200 extracted $138,200 that could have built reserves or carried a weather year. He put 3 stress scenarios on screen at 9% and 11% rates, then circled the same conclusion in red. If the operation needed optimistic prices to service equipment, the plan was brittle. One junior representative asked whether this meant financing was always bad. Wayne answered carefully. Financing can fit disciplined cash flow. Universal financing advice does not. By summer, he had retired from dealership sales exactly as projected, moved into used equipment consulting, and cut his income almost in half. He kept doing it because his client files stopped ending at courthouse steps. He also called Clint one evening in July, no audience, and apologized plainly for the showroom scene in 2019. Clint listened, said thank you for calling, and asked whether Wayne would review 2 rebuilding estimates on an older header. Wayne did, at no charge, and that was the extent of their reconciliation. practical, and complete. At the August 2027 co-op dinner, every named person in this story was accounted for in one room and one roll call, as promised by the trust bylaws. Aaron Pike, still on 600 acres, debt-light and profitable 3 consecutive seasons, now mentoring a second operator beyond Leah under his own written plan. Denise Harrow, bankruptcy supervision ended, 180 acres retained, bridge repayment pace ahead of schedule, teaching input purchasing discipline at winter meetings with Ben beside her. Miguel Tovar, custom route expanded, short debt cleared, tractor owned free and clear, Parker operating 190 acres after adding 1 leased tract without leverage strain. Roy and Carla Jensen, cattle share stable, note nearly retired, lease renewed 2 years. Leah Cruz, working capital positive for 2 straight year ends. Ben Alvarez, reserve target raised from $30,000 to $45,000 by choice. Parker Dunn, first cash rent paid early in 2027. Lyle Brenner's daughter, invited to the podium, reported that the $42,000 repayment Clint left at the funeral remained held and earmarked for apprenticeship tuition, intact and undocumented for no other use. Clint sat near the back, same faded overalls, same quiet posture, and left before dessert to check a bearing temperature in the shed. His 1998 Ford now read 349,070 miles, and the odometer still hesitated between digits for a breath before catching up. He had never fixed it, because it did not change the route. On a clear morning in late October 2027, he parked that truck by the same gate line and watched the paid-for combine cut soybeans in a steady strip of gold and brown. The machine that had once been a showroom argument was now trust property on paper and community capacity in practice, logged, maintained, and scheduled without panic. The restored planter from Aaron's auction had completed another season under covenant with no skipped service interval. The Jensen grain cart, once a liquidation line item, was running under Denise's crew that week and due back cleaned by Saturday, exactly as the sign-out sheet required. The brown folder held every receipt, every repayment, every maintenance log, every external verification call outcome, archived and reconciled. Nothing loose, nothing hidden, nothing abandoned. That is where the thesis ends, because that is where it began. Appearance never carried the weight people gave it. Arithmetic did. The man in stitched boots and a rusted truck was never poor in the way they meant. He was liquid when it mattered, patient when others were hurried, and generous only after the numbers could carry generosity without collapse. Debt was not evil in slogan form. It was dangerous when paired with volatility and treated as normal. Discipline looked small each day and enormous across decades, and the final image stayed ordinary on purpose. A thinning paint job at the gate, a combine paid in full, making one more clean pass, and families once marked for exit, still working the same ground under a sky that owed nobody certainty.